Dear Kevin, thank you so much for your time and availability to meet and talk with me.
Well, Antonio, I'm delighted to be able to do so again on the one proviso that we don't mention Ferrari.
Deal, deal. First of all, like you just mentioned, we met earlier and it's been a great pleasure to learn about you during our conversation. And in all honesty, what a discovery for me. I mean, going through your history and your bibliography. What I love about your story is how you were driven to become an author by your curiosity. But before exploring that part of your life, can we start from the beginning? How did Masonry came into your life?
A very long time ago, uh, I think really in the context of which you're asking, the first time I was asked to think about Freemasonry, I was probably about 13 years old, and it was my grandmother. Two of her brothers, at least that I'm aware of, were members of lodges, and they seemed to have a good time. They were members back in the 30s, well, from the 20s through the 30s and 40s, and there were other members who were in the wider family who were also members. And she said, look, they have hospitals, they have doctors, they have schools. If at any time you're in trouble, the chances are they'll help you. So if you get the opportunity to become a member, do it. So that was probably the first stepping stone. And then along the way, there were a couple of others that came up as well. But it's really my grandmother who was the one who implanted the idea way back when I was about 13, I guess.
So, except for your grandmother, was there a mentor or a brother that influenced you once that you started your Masonic journey?
I think my proposer has to be one of them. His name was Mike Alton. He's still a member. In fact, he's father of the lodge at the moment. So he's been around a long time with me in my Masonic career, and there have been others along the way who've, particularly when I started to do more and more of the investigation into Freemasonry, and I use the word investigation in preference to research, because really what I've been doing isn't research. That's something people do in the laboratory with test tubes and things like that. It's really sort of making inquiries. And I found that there were a number of brothers who were not only in my lodge, but who I gave talks to, and they all at the end of the day said, Kevin, you ought to write this down. We need a record of this as well. And that's how it started, really, and I went from there.
First of all, I mentioned, for me, you are a discovery, of course. I mean, even though you started your investigative work earlier than what was my Masonic journey, you have written 4 books, and 4 amazing books with different angles and different perspectives. Why have you written those books? What did drive you? And who was your audience? Were you writing because of your inner curiosity? Or were you writing because you were teaching to the Mason that is going to join tomorrow and become the next stone in the building of the temple?
No, I think originally, when I started to do the investigation, it was my curiosity to try and understand what it was that was going on in Freemasonry. It was, to me, it seemed ridiculous to think that maybe 200-300 years ago, there was a group of people who sat down possibly somewhere and decided to put this whole thing together, as a how can I put it, a gentleman's club, for example.
Yeah.
It is just far too, for somebody coming into Freemasonry, it is far too bizarre our workings for that to have happened. It had to have meant something, and something to somebody or group of people at some time. It had to have been derived from somewhere, even if it was a lot of somewheres and then pushed together. And that was what was in my mind. So I was trying to find out, because I kept asking people, what does this mean? What does that mean? And they kept saying to me, well, can't tell you that. That's a secret. and so which was obvious that they didn't know the answer.
Yeah.
And
I was actually told, I can't tell you, I have to kill you. So it's actually more constructive the way that you are saying it.
Exactly that. So I was this curiosity was then sort of encouraged, if you like, because I had people who were in reasonably senior positions, both within the lodge and within the province and elsewhere, and they seemed not to know the answers. And I kept thinking, this is crazy. So I just kept pushing along, because it was something that interested me. So that's really how it all started.
And I have to say, I'm reading now your books, and I'm one of those that I thought I knew something. I'm just like flabbergasted by some of the information you're sharing. And during the filming, there will be the title of your books that will appear, and I warmly suggest everybody to have a look at your work. It's just fascinating. What I like is the way that you tell the story. I like your, probably, I mean, certainly there is a lot of work that you put behind, but the way that I perceive it is I read a simple message, something that I can grasp, I can understand. And that creates in me curiosity to actually take that information and dig further. And that I really appreciate the way that you work. Now, Kevin, when you started working, I understand, I mean, you're driven by your curiosity, you don't find a counterpart, and then you start doing the research. The research become material that then is being used in order to write those books. Did you have a master plan at the beginning? Was everything part of, you knew that that's where you were going? How did those 4 books actually came along?
Or long before I started writing The Secrets of Solomon's Temple. As I think I hinted at, I was giving talks to lodges and groups of brethren on some of the things that I'd found already, okay? And very often those ideas that I was presenting ran in the face of everything that perhaps we'd been told about Freemasonry in the past. And I'm a guy who years ago came from a background where I was interested in change. And I knew, for example, that if somebody came along with a rather obscure idea, they were likely to be an outcast. Because particularly in organizations where you have a fairly rigid structure, a fairly long standing concept of not so much ritual, but various processes that they have. So then along comes somebody like me who says, now, hang on a moment, I think we ought to challenge this, okay? Right. So that sort of got me into the groove. And it was when then people started saying, write it down. Okay, so I would write these things out as papers. So it really started off as a collection of papers that I was writing and giving as talks in lodges. And then, of course, I got into doing the second degree tracing board, particularly as far as delivering that was concerned. And as we know, it's all about Solomon's Temple. Now, Solomon's Temple had intrigued me for decades, really, because this is a big question mark in my mind as to, I mean, did it exist? Did it not exist? There are archaeologists who say you'll never be able to find or trace anything which is in the Bible based on archaeology and that sort of thing. And there was one real little bit about Solomon's Temple, as recorded in the Old Testament, that really did dig into my brain. And it was this issue of the cherubim, which are in the Holy of Holies.
Yeah.
Because it says there are these two big cherubim, and they have wings which are stretched out such that the outer ones touch the outer walls of the Holy of Holies and meet in the middle.
Yeah.
Now, we're living in the time of Solomon's Temple, at a time when people did things to survive. You know, if they were extremely powerful, they might have had the odd ornament. But when you're going to build a temple, do you build an ornament like this without it has some use, whether it has some value?
Yeah.
And it just puzzled me for a long time as to what that was about. So it led me to start to then look at Solomon's Temple. And then there were all sorts of other questions came out as I started to dig further and further. So Solomon's Temple, in many respects, The Secrets of Solomon's Temple, was more a book by accident than design. All right. Okay. Because it was an accumulation of a lot of different things that I learned.
Yeah.
And I hope that answers the question for book one.
It does.
For book two, which was about chivalry, I had, within Freemasonry, there is mention of quite a number of orders of knighthood.
Yeah.
You're well aware of that. So I was well aware of one or two of them, like the Knights Templar. In fact, the town I lived in or was born, bred and buttered in, that was a stronghold of the Knights Templar. And I lived in an area where roads were called Priory Road and Knights Road and all this sort of thing. So a knowledge of some of the orders of knighthood were something that I grew up with.
Yeah.
So when I started to look at orders of knighthood, it came about because I was talking to the publisher of the first book. Actually, I'll tell you, we were in a bar. Right?
Great place to strategize. Great place to strategize.
Absolutely. And it had been his turn to buy the wine. Right? So he came back with a bottle. Right. So I'm taking a sip and I said, this is not a bad red wine, is it? And he said, and I picked the bottle up and turned it round, and the label said Templar. And so that prompted a conversation about the Knights Templar, you see, and we drifted into one or two other areas of knighthood that I had some, if you like, cursory understanding of.
Yeah.
And then about 2 days later, he telephoned me and he said, look, that conversation we had, would you like to write a book about chivalry? No, orders of knighthood. Oh, yes, I said, now, it's all very well that you say, oh, yes, but then the next thing is you've got to do it. Yeah. So the question was, where did I start? And I was hunting around, trying to find a way to gather information. And I was pointed at a particular book written by a guy later identified with Freemasonry. His name was Elias Ashmole.
Oh, yeah.
It was called Ashmole's Garter.
Correct.
And it was something he wrote way back about 1690 or something of that nature. And it was one of the royal palaces, somebody in the royal palaces, who had mentioned it to me. So I immediately found a copy of this book. I was very lucky that there was an original copy.
Wow, there are not that many. I tried. Yeah, there are not that many. Yes,
no, but there was one, and it was held in the archives of my local library. Wow. And so I was able to get myself in and get a copy of this book. And it proved to be an absolute revelation. And what it did was it inspired me to say, let me take this book in the passage of looking at all the orders of knighthood that have existed that we are aware of, where they are now or what happened to them, those that have survived, what are they doing now, if there are any, that is, and how did the whole concept of knighthood start in the first place? because that would then perhaps answer one of the questions, which relates to the first degree of Freemasonry. It's older than the Golden Fleece and Roman Eagle.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
And so that became sort of the starting point. That's how the book came about. And of course, along the way, as I've said, there covers a number of the orders of knighthood, which are mentioned in Freemasonry.
Yeah.
So that's book 2. So we've got book 1, we've got book 2 done, right? Now, book 3, now that was back totally to Freemasonry. One of the questions that's always been raised is, where did Freemasonry start? How did it start? I go back to my bit of the guys sitting around the table. We felt, I felt that was not on, and I felt that it had to have come from somewhere, some noble origin. And so I started to dig and dig, and I came across a book which had been written by the master of the Company of Masons in London, one of the guilds. And in that book, he mentions that he felt that there was a separate organisation attached to the work of the operative Masons. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Now, what sort of thing could that be? And I found that there was another organisation of guilds which were known as the religious guilds, and I'd never heard of them before. But the religious guilds were organisations which certainly in England became the foundation of many of what today we would call the insurance companies, the big name insurance companies, and other things as well. And they can, religious guilds can be traced right back to the year 800. And they all had their ceremonies. To become a member, you had to have a reasonable amount of cash to start off with. You joined a particular religious guild. Money was invested in, shall we say, trading wool or trading lace or something like that with merchants. You had to have paid in perhaps for 10 years before you could receive any benefit. But if you were then, shall we say, you had an accident in your line of work and you were then unable to carry on your trade, or perhaps you had reached a stage in life where you just couldn't pick up a trowel anymore, you wanted to retire.
Yeah.
So that guild of which you were a member paid you a pension.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and eventually all the trades had these sort of side guilds, if you like.
Yeah.
And so I traced them back, and I make the case in that book that was really where the origins of Freemasonry came from, where we get the connection, if you like, from the operative Masons through to Freemasonry as we know it today. So having been down that path, that's the third book. So the fourth book, which is Freemasonry Decoded, really was an attempt to look at so many of the other things that we see and that we know about Freemasonry, we don't know about Freemasonry, to test whether or not they're real. And the other part that was of interest to me was the Royal Arch, because there was a question of where did that come from? And having been a member of the Royal Arch for some time, I kept looking around, I kept hearing things, but again, nobody explained anything. And I went off and I started to look at some of the issues of the Royal Arch, and I found, well, I can only describe it as some of the most breathtaking information. Sadly, I did a little bit of research for the area where my mother lodge is, and it was on the subject of why people left Royal Arch. And I found, in talking to a number of them, they kept saying, "Oh, it's boring." And I thought, "Oh, that's enlightening. Why is it boring?" But then once I discovered more and more about the Royal Arch, it really comes alive. And I just felt if only people understood what I've just found out, and which seems to be verified through the Royal Arch, nobody would be bored. It's a wonderful, wonderful degree. So what I found again, I put into the fourth book.
Brilliant.
So there you are. That's a long answer to a very short question.
Very true. And actually, you're leading me to my next question. Actually, you have two questions because you're touching two subjects that are very close to Freemasonry and perception of Freemasonry. The first
does
one.
This means I've stitched myself up.
No, don't worry. Kevin, I've written some lectures. I deliver lectures. I've been talking to Masons from different places in the world, and every time, like you're suggesting, you enter into, if you're curious enough, you start investigating, digging for more information, and every time you discover something, it just keeps on going. You want to know more, and you want to discover more. Is there a particular story or a particular character that in one of the 4 books surprised you with the information that you discover related to that?
Well, there are 2 actually, if I may. One is in the craft, one is in the Royal Arch. The one in the craft relates to decoding the second degree tracing board. I was so familiar with it, I kept thinking there has to be something behind all this. And yes, so I've worked that one out. That's in Freemasonry Decoded. And the other one was in the Royal Arch, discovering sort of how classical architecture was rediscovered. And and that discovery is embodied within one of the main ceremonies of the Royal Arch. But it's if you take that ceremony, you start to take it apart, you realise that the story that's being told is not quite what is presented in the Royal Arch. It's actually about the rediscovery of classical architecture, and that really did surprise me. By the way, one of the other things I should tell you is that very often when I've been doing this investigation, I've had a policy very much of trying to go to the places where various events supposedly occurred. Okay, I have found that sometimes you go to these places and you really get a feel for what was going on. Of course, I was able to take some of my own photographs, so I didn't have to rely on libraries, so which was a big benefit. And it was amazing sometimes the little details you can pick up that you would never have picked up anywhere else. And in both cases, the second degree tracing board and this particular ceremony in Royal Arch, that was where a lot of that information came from. It was by going and looking and hearing and listening to other people, and that was wonderful.
Kevin, the next question is actually a question for a non-Mason. But before asking you that question, you trigger me something that I would like to ask you before, based on what you just said. Is Freemasonry a secret society?
The formal answer is that it's not a secret society. How can it be a secret society when so many people know that it exists? Right? Especially not my wives know it exists, girlfriends know it exists.
Exactly.
So it can't be a secret society. But some years ago, Grand Lodge came up with the idea that it's a society with secrets. And yeah, I think the allegories, which much of the knowledge of Freemasonry is built behind, it's not so much a secret. It's just that it's difficult to discover. And as I have found out, and no doubt you have too, it's difficult to discover. But once you know what's there, or shall I say, I mustn't be arrogant. Once I say what my research has suggested is there, that's probably the better phrase, then it just opens up a whole new world. And it's just a wonderful. And there is just so much to know, so much to learn that people these days, our society in general, has forgotten all about, you know?
Yeah. The approach that you have in your storytelling is humble, meaning that I have a question, I don't find the answer, I go and start investigating. I challenge the sources that I'm using in order to make sure that the information that I have found are correct. And here, the reader is presented with the result of your work. As such, your reader is not necessarily only a Freemason. There is history, mythology, and every other subject that we cover in our works. Now, a question for a non-Mason in 2023. What is Freemasonry about?
I think if I'm talking to a non-Mason who perhaps had a passing interest in Freemasonry, as I have already done so many times, I try and say that, first of all, one of the great things about Freemasonry is the camaraderie and what you get from that camaraderie, because there are so few places these days, particularly where that young men can gather, which are not sort of part of organized religious organizations or sporting clubs, but just a bunch of guys who get together and set out to have what I would call a good evening together, with a bit of banter, as we know goes on when a bunch of guys get together, and perhaps a drink at the bar or whatever. But and a nice meal usually at the end of the evening, where there is more banter and a totally different atmosphere. So that's I would say that the camaraderie is one of the big things. Okay. The second thing is that there are other benefits in Freemasonry. For example, in England, I'm sure you're well aware that in the event that something happens in a family and there are children, the children get looked after. There is an option for that to happen. So there is what I would call almost an insurance policy, because there's also, through Masonic charities, support for illness and support for all sorts of organisations that we all use, that Freemasonry also helps.
True.
Helping within the community. So there are all these other benefits as well. And then on top of that, education these days deals with very narrow subjects, because it's all about testing people to see how much about a prescribed process of education they've absorbed. It's not about what they know, it's just about whether or not they can pass a test, or how will they pass the test that the government has prescribed. Okay, and that's how I see Freemasonry, and particularly once if you look at some of the things I've written in Solomon's Temple, well, Chivalry, and Freemasonry Decoded, there are a lot of aspects there which deal with what the philosophers of old discovered. And that's just not taught in a lot of schools, not even taught on university courses.
No, you're right.
So I think it gives another level of education and appreciation of the greater world about us.
How do you see Freemasonry changing because the members and the future members are part of a society that is going to be much more focused on, window dressing rather than content?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges that Freemasonry's got for perhaps the next 10 years. But then by the same token, if you think in terms of the typical age at which somebody becomes a Freemason, whilst on our literature, we're very lucky to be able to show that we've got lots of younger guys who are associated with it. At the end of the day, a lot of the people who join Freemasonry do so either in their late 30s or their early 40s. I know the university schemes are in place, and some of them, particularly where they have a very strong culture of reference to whoever their students were, those sort of lodges, they do hold up well. But I think those people who are in what we call that traditional age band for joining, I don't think it will have much effect on them, much at all. I think they would if they wanted to become Freemasons, they would join and etc. But those that are in that younger age group, Generation Z, in particular, where they've grown up from the almost 6 months old of tapping out keys and doing all sorts of 2 years old
pages. Yeah.
2 years old can build your computer.
Very true.
I think that generation is going to be where we have the problem in the future. And but at the end of the day, Freemasonry is about an interaction between people. And if we have a society which doesn't interact and becomes insular, then which is the sort of thing which could well have developed out of our experience with COVID.
Yeah.
I think people will want to interact with people, and where that's the case, there's still got to be a market for Freemasonry.
Understood. It's a very good point. Kevin, I'm going to put you under the spotlight. Okay, and I'm going to just, expose this secret. You told us about book 1, book 2, the work on book 3, and the output of book 4. Now, is there a book 5 in the making?
My answer to that question is there could be.
You were taught to be cautious. I see that you are being taught to be cautious. That's good.
Yes, I have got more than enough material for a book 5. The question has been one of there's been, as you know, changes in publishers and things like that. So it's a question of whether or not we can do it in the old format, whether or not we're going to think about doing it in a new format, whether or not it happens at all. But it's the information is there. I've got it sort of all pretty well recorded, either sort of in books, my notebooks, or up here, and it could be done. It could be done.
Look forward to it. So everybody take note. There will be a book 5. That's already a discovery. So for me, the question that comes is very easy, Kevin. I look at brethren and authors like you, and I get inspired because you present me with information that either I didn't know or I knew but at a different dimension, and therefore you allow me to look at it from different perspective. But a person like you, who does inspire Kevin today?
Somebody who's not in Freemasonry, I'm assuming.
Interesting.
People who inspire me in the what I call the general environment are people like James Dyson, Richard Branson, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. And the reason they inspire me is because they are all in the realms of being a disruptor. Okay? Now, to some degree, in some of the things I've been writing, I'm a disruptor too. Because what I've been doing is, in some respects, challenging some of the age-old ideas about Freemasonry. But whereas in the past there have been some of these ideas been put forward, and not a lot of support evidence. The thing that I realized very early on when I started writing was that There's no point in saying, I think this, I think that, boom, boom. It's got to be substantiated
Yeah.
as much as possible by available evidence. And so that's where I've come from. But it puts me really into the realm of being a disruptor. And I just love disruptors. You know, they are the people who create change,
Yeah.
which ultimately ends up by being of great value to us in terms of economy or whatever. In some cases, it might be medical science or whatever. Oh no, I'm into disruptors in a big way.
Kevin, unfortunately for me, our time is up. So I really enjoyed, one, first of all, meeting with you, discovering about your work, but I hope as much as the audience, discovering who you are behind the pen or the keyboard when you do your work. I really enjoyed it. And like you say, I recognize the creativity that you bring on the table. It's not just a traditional, it used to be and it is. You actually go through that part. So I recognize your response. Thank you so much. Thank you for your work, and thank you for whatever you're going to be writing next, because I'm sure that is going to be delightful to read it.
Well, Antonio, all I can say is thank you very much indeed for inviting me. You've put me on the spot there a couple of times, and I've had to think a little faster than perhaps I would do, sort of keeping in mind that for you it's mid-afternoon, for me it's getting on for midnight.
It's true. It's true. Kevin.
But I've certainly managed to get through it, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the openness, and I'm looking forward for the next book, so we will organize another conversation.
I look forward to that. Thank you, Antonio.
Thank you. Bye-bye.